Our first speaker is Craig Helmsley. He is a Texas native tracker biologist in the Wildlife Diversity Division of Texas Parks and Wildlife. He has shared his love of the natural world with people of all ages for over 35 years, from Minnesota to the Texas Hill Country. Craig has a BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Management and an MS in Zoology.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to present here, and thrilled to be able to talk with you all for the next 30 minutes. So we're just going to jump in. We're going to kind of start off with just talking about some of the native plants and riparian habitats, as the flyer said. I should tell you, when you start to put together a 30-minute presentation on this topic, is that 30 minutes is not clearly close enough to cover them all, because there is so much, and there's so much diversity across the state of Texas. So when you talk about riparian plants of the Chihuahuan Desert, or you talk about riparian plants of East Texas, or you talk about the riparian plants up in the Panhandle, they're going to be different, a little bit different. So what I happen to live in the Texas Hill Country, so I'm kind of going based on my what I know about around here, and then in general in terms of riparian plants. So we're going to try to give you sort of an idea of some of the more common riparian plants. It certainly is not an exhaustive list, but it should be fairly representative, and hopefully some of the plants you see here you'll recognize by either the exact species or a similar species as we go forward. So we'll go ahead and get started. First, I want to just briefly mention that I do work for the Texas Nature Trackers program within the Wildlife Diversity program of Texas Parks and Wildlife. And what our team, our community stewardship and engagement team, does within the Wildlife Diversity group is we try to connect community scientists to the natural world, and then be a bridge between community scientists that contribute data about the flora and fauna of the state of Texas to the researchers and the folks that take that data and turn it into something that's useful for practical on-the-ground conservation. So we kind of serve as the middle people in trying to connect the volunteer community to the research community. So first of all, let's jump right into it. So real quickly, what is a riparian area? It's basically a plant community growing nearest the water's edge. The zone can be, a few feet wide. It can be 100 feet wide. It could be wider than that even. But generally, it's between the edge of the water and where you shift to kind of the upland areas. You can kind of see that represented there on that diagram. And from the Texas waters, exploring water and watersheds, riparian area is the interface between the aquatic and the terrestrial habitats. So it's a pretty nice definition. Vegetation can vary tremendously depending upon the size, variability of stream flow, and where you are along the course of the stream, whether you're a class 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, because of the great diversity that we have in vegetation and ecosystems here in Texas, depends on where you are. Functions of riparian areas, of course, filter sediment from surrounding floodplain and or wetlands. So basically, it's a filter. If there's runoff of soil coming down from above, that riparian area can help slow that sedimentation down, getting into the waterway. So that's a big help. And when you don't have those riparian areas, that's why you typically will see a lot of runoff that is soil laden or nutrient laden and can cause significant problems in wetlands. Of course, stream bank erosion, those roots that those plants form help stabilize the bank, so you have less deposition or less erosion during flooding events. Provides adjacent floodwater storage, so that's those plants and the roots and that are out there are going to help slow down the rush of water, spread the water out, so that the flooding isn't as severe in some ways. And then, of course, the riparian areas are a massive habitat for a wide variety of wildlife, from nesting bald eagles to snails and everything else that grows out there and lives out there in those riparian habitats. So really important, very critical habitats. The way I'm approaching this presentation is I'm going to talk about plants from the standpoint of the different layers, and basically, and you might have different, depending on how technical you are, there are different layers beyond these 4 basic ones, but you have the canopy, the tallest trees out there, the understory, the trees that generally don't get as tall, when those big, tall canopy trees are there. And then the shrub layer, and then the ground layer that consists of all kinds of things right there. So we're going to cover it from the canopy, starting with the canopy and work our way down to the forest floor and kind of work our way all the way to the edge of the water as well at the conclusion of this presentation. So I'll start with the canopy trees, the 3 canopy trees that I think of when I think of riparian habitats would be the biggest, tallest one, the bald cypress, and certainly through the hill country in large parts of Texas, you can figure out where every stream is as you drive down a highway by just looking for those kind of flat-topped, giant cypress trees that are growing along most of our streams that carry water for any length of time here in Texas, in many parts of Texas. And then 2 other ones that I associate with wetlands for the most part, sycamore and cottonwood, but both of those are adaptable trees. I've seen sycamores growing on I-10 on the tops of the hills going from Comfort to Kerrville, so they can show up just about anywhere. Sycamores and cottonwoods are also planted in many situations, so you'll see them in a variety of areas. I will say those 2 trees, after flooding events where the land has been kind of scraped bare or where there's been a deposition of mud and soil, those 2 trees are really significant pioneering trees. I've seen situations in riparian areas after a flood where cottonwood trees come in by the thousands. Small cottonwood trees will just take over. And what that does is kind of creates a stable system to reestablish stability to the ground level. And then those cottonwood trees, of course, and sycamores have to kind of fight it out for survival. The bald cypress, of course, are massive trees. The trees we see around here are probably, you know, teenagers or middle-aged trees compared to what used to be here, but they're still massive trees. All of these trees provide food for a variety of birds and other wildlife. So they can be very, very important. This time of the year, you'll see finches, especially feeding on the balls of sycamore that are still left up in the trees. Then we get down under that canopy, and again, a little walnut could be a canopy tree depending on where you are in the state, or even a pecan tree. These trees too will grow not only in the floodplain riparian area, but they can grow in upland areas as well. And of course, we know pecan has been adapted to a lot of different places. Both of these trees have compound leaves. You can see they're fairly similar in terms of the looks of the leaves. The fruits obviously are different. The little walnut has a walnut fruit that is much smaller than the standard black walnut that you would find farther to the north. They're an important mast food for squirrels and deer and wild turkeys and a variety of other wildlife as well. And then keeping with some of the understory trees, and again, this varies, but you have both cedar elm and hackberry, both of which are capable of growing not only in wetland situations, but in upland situations, as you are probably aware of. Both of them can be very important trees for wildlife. The fruits of hackberry are very valuable food sources for cedar waxwings and robins and mockingbirds and other fruit-eating birds and wildlife. And then in the fall, when the cedar elm puts on its fruit, finches and cardinals are in there taking out those seeds and eating those right away. Other elms that might grow down in a riparian area, of course, would be slippery elm, American elm, if you can find one. Both of those are increasingly hard to find trees, but they will grow in those riparian or floodplain situations as well. And then continuing to kind of get smaller and smaller a little bit, Texas ash. It's a little harder to find. I've found a population of them along Honey Creek over east of Bernie, and they have opposite compound leaves. They have fruit that is very good for birds. It's a slow-growing tree relative, and some people would say that this and white, I think it's white ash, would be the same species, or this is a subspecies. There's debate about that. It goes back and forth. Box elder is another tree. This is our most common maple tree that we have, certainly around here. There's big tooth maple that grows in upland situations, but box elder actually is a maple tree. Speaking as a person that used to live in Minnesota, it does not make high quality maple syrup, but if you're desperate, it can. It takes a lot of sap to turn it into some maple syrup, though, and the quality is not as good. They have green stems. They have opposite compound leaves. The leaves a lot of times will fool you, and you're going to think, especially if it's low growing, that it's poison ivy. It's a tree that doesn't get real big out and around here. I've seen them farther north get very large, but a lot of people consider them kind of a waste tree. But again, they have value in a riparian setting to help stabilize soil and provide cover for wildlife. Getting into kind of the lower canopy, the end of the lower, the low end of the lower canopy, and even almost shrub-like plants, we have both roughly dogwood and possum haw. Possum haw, of course, produces those brilliant red berries on the female trees. So you have male and female trees. The leaves are kind of obovate. They're a little bit wide in the middle, but kind of towards the tip. They have very faint teeth. And alternate leaves, although it's kind of hard to tell with that one. With rough leaf dogwood, as with most dogwoods, they have opposite leaves. They have an interesting venation that's rounded like this, as opposed to jagged or pointed or parallel. They produce those white flowers in the spring and then white fruits in the late summer that robins and other fruit-eating birds will eat as well. So 2 really valuable trees along riparian habitats. Another 2 that I see in floodplains, riparian habitats, wafer ash actually grow up in uplands as well, but these 2 are smaller shrubs generally or usually. The wafer ash produces flowers that are actually, they're green, but they're actually fairly fragrant. They're attractive to lots of different kinds of pollinators, including night flying moths. They're a host plant for the giant and two-tailed swallowtail. And then, of course, there's the buckeye. In our area, we have both both varieties of Aesculus pavia, the yellowish flowering one, and then also the red. And then those will intermingle, and you'll have kind of a orange flowers. Those are blooming. The leaves of those are very early to emerge. We have a couple of them in our yard, and the leaves have already come out. The flowers are in bud right now, so I expect them to flower within the next week. But you'll see these growing in real high quality, not overgrazed riparian areas. And again, these can grow in a little bit higher away from the waterways as well. And then down closer to the water level, nearer the water, really, for the most part, with the exception of Turk's cap, which is pretty highly adaptable. Indigo bush and button bush are very, very valuable riparian plants. They are, all 3 of these are wonderful pollinating plants. You can find them in native plant sales and places like that. But indigo bush tends to be a little bit of a spindly kind of shrub. I've seen it. I grew it in Iowa or Nebraska when I lived there. I grew it to about 8-9 feet. Has purplish orange and orange flowers in the springtime. Button bush is easily recognized. It has trifoliate leaves. I mean, it has not trifoliate, for gosh sakes. It has leaves that are 3 at a node. Sorry, the term is escaping my brain right now, but it has those white balls of flowers. All of these are great pollinating plants. And oftentimes you'll find button bush and indigo bush growing right along the edges of streams and rivers. Turk's cap will grow there as well, as in other settings. And then we have a couple of plants that look, for all the world when they're growing, almost like woody plants, but they're actually perennial plants that die back each year and then grow back from the base. Lindheimer senna is one that will grow in a wide variety of settings and upland settings. But the reason I included it here is that when you have a big flooding event, like along the Guadalupe River that happens sometimes, you get these big gravel bars or sand bars. Lindheimer senna tends to be an early plant that comes in vast numbers and helps stabilize the soil. The same thing can be said with rattlepod, Sesbania, and there's different species of that. Will do the same thing. If you go in our area, if you go to little county park in Kendall County called, oh my gosh, James Keel Park, you'll see that Sesbania is all over the place in the floodplain, kind of right up above the river. So these can be very important plants to help stabilize after flooding situations. We can't forget about woody, and again, there are many more trees that we could have talked about: black willow, tupelo, all kinds of things, desert willow, just to kind of get around to different parts of the state. So this is just kind of a representative sample. And then woody vines, there are a lot of woody vines. They grow on the ground, they grow in the shrub layer, they grow all the way into the canopy. All of them produce fruit that are good for wildlife, birds, even poison ivy. Birds feed on poison ivy berries all the time. And of course, dewberry typically grows low across the ground and produces that wonderful fruit. They'll be flowering here within the next week or so, I would guess. And then of course you have the different species of grape, you have different species of greenbrier, and then of course Virginia creeper, which sometimes it has 5 leaflets, compound leaflets, versus the 3 for poison ivy. But again, all of these are important down in those areas along the riparian zone. And then just a very quick sampling of grasses. You have the ones that are the most obvious ones out in riparian areas, and then adjacent areas to those riparian areas is bushy bluestem, eastern gamma grass, Lindheimer muley, which of course is a very popular native plant put in landscape settings, of course. Switchgrass, there are different varieties of switchgrass. The native switchgrass can grow in floodplain native prairies in upland situations, but also helps stabilize because of the massive root systems, help stabilize banks along streams. And then wood oats, that's the one that's going to grow mostly in shaded or lightly shaded areas, whereas the others typically grow out in open areas. Although saying that, I've seen bushy bluestem and eastern gamma grass in completely canopied floodplain areas right along Honey Creek. So these grow in a lot of settings. One of the interesting things I find that if you find Lindheimer muley or you find bushy bluestem, that usually indicates there's a seep or some sort of water supply underneath where they're growing, because sometimes they'll grow surprisingly far up from those wetland situations. Of course, we have different kinds of ferns that are out here. Alabama lip fern is fairly common, maidenhair fern, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And then river fern is another larger fern that grows along certain stream banks and more to the east than around here, but we do have some of that in this area as well. So those are, again, very, very beautiful, unique plants that grow in those riparian areas. And the reason I'm showing you a lot of these, and especially with the wildflowers, if you have a riparian area or zone and you don't have any of this diversity, it's entirely possible that you have too much overgrazing by deer, or some kind of habitat degradation is going down, is dragging down that riparian area. So these are things, examples of wildflowers to look for in those riparian settings. And we're just going to go by color. So we'll start out with bright red, of course, in the summertime. Cardinal flower is going to be blooming along a lot of streams. In small creeks, it might be growing right in the middle of the creek, actually, in rocky flats. And then columbine typically is going to grow a little bit farther outside of the immediate riverbank and is going to be up on the rocky ledges, up in that riparian zone, or even going up into the upland zone. But both of them beautiful plants, wonderful for hummingbirds and a lot of other pollinators when they're blooming. Then we have a variety of water primroses. These are just 2 representative species here. Ludwigia, I call it. I don't know if I pronounce that right or not, but these are plants that the floating water primrose forms mats. And those mat forming plants that grow near water or along the edge of the water can help stabilize the bank, especially with the fine sediments that will wash off. They'll kind of hold those in place. And then as other plants come in and do more to stabilize the bank, these plants can be kind of intermediate in terms of helping with controlling that erosion. A couple of them that grow in riparian zones, golden groundsel, which it should be blooming right now or just about to bloom. And then large buttercup in my yard that just started blooming yesterday. But large buttercup is going to typically grow in floodplain areas, maybe a little bit out of that. Golden groundsel I mostly find down in floodplain or riparian zones. Both of them beautiful springtime yellow blooming flowers. Later in the year, and again, these can grow in different settings, especially cowpen daisy and tall goldenrod. But that said, these are also growing in riparian areas. Cowpen daisy is an large annual that will dominate areas sometimes, and in other years it'll be gone. But you'll see that in floodplain areas and in open, mostly sunny, mostly open riparian areas as well. Beggar's ticks, there are burr marigold. There are lots of different species of that that grow in different settings along riparian areas. And again, a lot of this value of these plants, not only is it good for wildlife, but it's also the root systems are helping stabilize soil. And then tall goldenrod grows in a wide variety of upland prairie, but it also then grows closer to where it's a little bit wetter, and it blooms in the fall again. So you're going to see this one, it's going to be kind of inconspicuous until the fall. But again, it's one that will move into areas that have been recently disturbed and will help stabilize soils there as well. And then a couple of germanders that grow, at least in our area, and the Canadense grows around large parts of the state. These can be very rank in open, sunny areas. I've seen them growing in shaded areas along riparian zones. Cutleaf germander typically is a little smaller, finer plant growing along clean streams and places like that. But these are examples of a couple of these wildflowers that you might stumble across. And then in terms of white flowering plants, lots of them, of course. Two of the bigger ones that we're going to see that are perennials are frostweed and late boneset. Late boneset and frostweed can grow in upland situations. I've seen them in all of the different places, but particularly down along floodplains, in riparian zones, you'll often see frostweed, and a little bit less so a late boneset, but in open areas, you might see boneset in those riparian areas where it's a little bit sunnier. But frostweed can grow in shady areas, sunny areas, and of course, both of these can be very, very significant pollinating plants. And a source for nectar for migrating monarchs in the fall, particularly frostweed, one of the most important ones. And these are plants that a lot of times in the summertime, they don't look very good because it gets hot and dry, but let them get through that period. And in the fall, they'll produce lots of flowers, lots of nectar sources for pollinators of all kinds. And then a couple of smaller ones. One that grows in the spring that's getting ready to flower now is Marbleseed or false Cromwell. This is one that probably is overlooked by a lot of people, but it grows in shaded areas, down in riparian areas. I've seen it in upland areas and shaded areas. The flowers themselves are rather unique, but this turns out, it doesn't look like it would be much of a flower for pollinators, but I've seen hummingbirds nectar on this, all kinds of butterflies, including monarchs and pipevine swallowtails, bumblebees nectar on it. A really important, probably often overlooked, unique looking, I think, wildflower of those situations in the spring. And in the fall, we have a plethora of asters. One example is Texas aster. It grows in riparian areas and in other settings, of course. But these are just a few of those examples of some of the wildflowers you might see in a riparian zone. And then we have a few of the other things that as you get closer to the water, right to the edge of the water. Bog nettle is a false nettle, so it doesn't sting. It looks like, the leaves look like a nettle. The flowers look a little bit nettle-like, but it's so indistinct sometimes we often don't see it. It kind of just blends in. But you'll see that growing right along the edge of streams. And then frog fruit, which can grow in a wide variety of settings. There's multiple species, but a lot of times they are down in those floodplain zones or riparian areas. And again, in a flooding event, these can be a plant that stabilizes. They grow along the ground, put down a lot of roots. They can stabilize soil, and it's a host plant for the Phaeon crescent. It's also, those flowers are really popular among many, many species of butterflies. And then again, when we get right to the edge of the water, or even in the water, the edge of the water, you have watercress, which is not native, but is an edible plant, by the way. It's in the crucifera family. And then you have water willow, which is very extensive plant along riparian areas. Again, a good stabilizer with roots, has beautiful little flowers you can see up there in that inset photograph. And then out in the water, or right along the edge of the water, water pennyroyal or water pennyrote wart that has multiple species of that as well. So that just gives you kind of an introduction to, I hope this is what is adequate for what was requested today. This gives you an idea that there is a great deal of plant diversity in our riparian zones. A healthy riparian zone, by the way, this is a friend of mine, I took this picture at Guadalupe River State Park. Riparian zones are critical to water quality. I grew up in Iowa, and riparian zones would get to the point where some farmers would crop right to the edge of the river or creek. And as a result, the water was muddy. There was always runoff. There was nothing to stabilize the banks, so the banks deteriorated over time. So these riparian zones are critical to water quality, the health of the ecosystem of the critters that live in the water, and of course, adjacent to the water. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you very much.